Well, hello and welcome to this webinar. My name is Paul Harrison and I am going to be taking you through this session. Now, this particular webinar is the most detailed that we're going to provide in terms of the approach to church, to running other Christian faith-based organisations in the context of lockdown, in the current coronavirus context. It's the most detailed explanation that we're going to provide. There are other alternative formats that are available on the website. But with this particular approach, we do want to look at this in slightly more detail just to help those who may be struggling with their response from a safeguarding perspective to the current situation. And so while I don't want to take more time than I need, I'm not going to rush to keep this to a very short presentation. It is a complex subject and it requires that we do give this some thought, and I want to do justice to that. Now, obviously, in a session such as this, it's not possible for me to answer every single question that every single person will have. The aim of this session is just to help us to at least start to think through whether our response thus far has been sufficient or whether there's areas that we need to strengthen. And also, as this situation continues, is our approach adequate to managing the risks that we're facing at this time? And so that's what I want to do, is to give you those thought processes. Now, there may be specific questions, there may be things that are about your context that we don't cover, there may be specific questions that you still have at the end of this session. And we do offer an advice line. We don't charge for the advice line, and so if you do have ongoing questions, we're more than happy for you to contact us. The contact details are at the end of this video, and they're also on the website, obviously. So please don't hesitate to make contact if you do have specific questions that aren't covered here. These are, as we've already said, challenging times, very difficult times for us, and there are many challenges from a safeguarding perspective in the current context. Those challenges are many and varied, and not every church will be experiencing the same challenges, obviously. But the speed at which things have been developing and have been changing has been quite astonishing. The speed at which lockdown was introduced, and on a day-by-day basis we're continually monitoring the situation, and many of us have perhaps found ourselves really just scrambling to keep up with what is going on, and how as churches do we respond to this current situation. And then, of course, there's a great deal of uncertainty. We don't know how things are going to play out as yet, and so we're almost going week to week, or possibly even day to day, trying to get the feel for where things are going. And so the combination of the speed of change and the constant uncertainty makes it very difficult for us as churches to plan carefully and to put in place appropriate processes and systems. As well as that, many of us have been wrestling with new technology, trying to find the best way to continue the ministry of the church, trying to find ways to continue the community and at least the teaching ministry of the church. And that has been challenging for many of us. For many of us, it's been a real steep learning curve, and I say that for myself as a church leader, having to get to grips with new approaches. And that's challenging, isn't it? It's challenging for all of us. But of course, another challenge that some of us may face is that although we have a steep learning curve, or maybe you haven't, maybe you're fairly tech savvy and the learning curve hasn't been too steep, but you're ministering to people who aren't used to using this kind of technology. And so it's not only about thinking about our own ability to adapt to this situation, but it's also how will our congregations, how will our people respond to that? And actually, if we're encouraging people to use technology when they're not familiar with it, they're not very tech savvy, it may well be that we're actually placing them at risk because they don't know how to keep themselves safe. And so we do need to think about how do we help people to keep themselves safe as they start to use new technologies. And then, of course, we have the challenge of isolation. For us as churches, that's really difficult. I know for me, since cancelling all our meetings, I seem to spend far more time actually trying to keep in touch with people. It's a lot easier when you have people in the room in front of you and you can chat to people. Trying to keep up to speed with what's going on when we're simply using technology can be challenging. It can be difficult, and so people are feeling isolated. But there's also that lack of visibility, so it makes it more difficult for us to respond pastorally to situations that may be arising. But at the same time, we might be thinking about the opportunities that there are, the opportunities that it's presenting for us. And it may be that you've been trying out some different technology, and maybe now you're at the stage where you're thinking, actually, it would be really useful to continue to use this on an ongoing basis. And that might be some small chink of positivity in what is a very difficult situation, a tragic situation for so many. But how do we maintain effective ministry in these times, and how do we make sure that we're seeing and maximising any opportunities that there may be? And of course, all of this takes time. And if you're anything like me, trying to stay on top of things, having cancelled all the meetings, you would think it would be quieter, wouldn't you? But it's not. Time is absolutely at a premium at the moment. And so I don't want to take longer than I need to on this webinar, but equally, I do want to help by just expressing some of the things that we have been thinking through and some of the lessons that we're learning as we go along. So there's some of the challenges that we're facing in these times. As we approach these challenges, there are various things that we need to consider. Now, I don't want to suggest that these are the only things for us to consider, but this is how we want to approach this webinar. And we're going to look at 5 key areas that we need to think through. The first is that of care. How do we care for our members, for those who are part of our church community in these times? I want us to think a little bit about governance, because this is a really important theme. The responsibilities of the trustees, the responsibilities of the church leaders to safeguard, etc., don't go away just because we're operating in unusual times. It's really important that we have good governance in place, and we'll think a little bit about that. I want to take a little bit of time to think about how we deal with our policies and procedures in this context. I want to think about the importance of vigilance. And then I want to look at what will perhaps be the slightly longer section around technology and some of the things to think about as we take church online and as we use technology more. So they're the key areas that I want us to cover in this webinar. Obviously, one of the key areas for us to think about is how do we care for the congregation. Now, at this stage, I don't want to address that question particularly. We'll come on to that as we go through this webinar. But what I do want to encourage us to do is to think about who are the people within the congregation who need care, who need support at this time. Obviously, we have a number of people potentially within our church family who may be already vulnerable people. They had challenges, they had support needs, maybe we were working with them, or maybe we were just providing that emotional support for them with various challenges that they're facing. This may be people who are elderly, it may be adults with learning difficulties, or children with some kind of special educational need. It may even be that you have some children, for example, who are on a child protection plan, a child protection register, or adults who are at risk of abuse, and those kinds of things. And we had things in place. And obviously we want to continue to offer support to those people, but in a context now, obviously, where we're not necessarily able to see to see them face to face. And so we have some people who we would already have been seeking to support, but now we need to find new ways to support them. As I say, that would include children or adults who are being protected, being safeguarded by the local authority. It may also be that within the context of the church, you have someone who is either an ex-offender or who poses maybe a risk to children or to vulnerable adults, and perhaps you have a formal contract in place with them. And there will be various things that you're putting in place to support that person. And so we need to think through, what does that look like in the context of church online? Probably many of the things that you had in place by way of limitations or by way of support for that person will have to change. And it's really important that we review that and that we look at that in this context. Taking things online, while it's a great way to do church at this moment in time, and that there is, and we're very grateful that there is in this day, so much technology that we can use, but it could introduce temptation for those people who struggle in this way, and it could place others at risk as a result. And so it's really important that we think through anybody that we're managing from that point of view. And then, of course, there will be people who we never regarded as being vulnerable, we never regarded as being having a support need, but who now are becoming vulnerable, their new vulnerabilities. That may be people who are beginning to struggle with the isolation and with their own mental health, and so we need to be supporting them. It might be much more practical help where we have people who are self-isolating or people who have contracted coronavirus, COVID, and so need some practical help and support. It may be that some of the folks within the church are key workers. That they are people who are involved on the front line with all of the many pressures that will bring, whether that be in health services or other emergency response services, the fire service, the police, paramedics, these kinds of people, whether that be social care settings or carers, whether that be key workers who are keeping shops open, who are keeping transport moving, distribution moving, those who are involved in schools, caring for children whose parents are key workers, and all of these kinds of things. And so we may have those kinds of people who are under a lot of pressure at the moment, and so are becoming more vulnerable and need some more support. It may, for some of us, be that we have some larger households where crowding and limited space is a real issue for them. And so whereas they were coping before, now things are becoming increasingly difficult. Many people, of course, could be facing financial pressures and loss of income and lots of uncertainty around that. And so we need to be aware not only of those existing vulnerabilities and existing support needs, but also of new and emerging support needs. And of course, that's particularly difficult in a context where we're not seeing people necessarily as often as we used to do. And then, of course, we want to be thinking about how can we be a blessing to our communities? How can we minister to our communities? How can we support those within our communities who are in need? And what are the opportunities for us to be a blessing to them? And so we've got to be rethinking how we care for each other and also for our community. Obviously, as we start to bring in new approaches, there are things that we need to think through, and I will come to that later. But I thought it was worth at this stage just reminding us that there will be people who are becoming vulnerable, even though they weren't vulnerable previously. And there will be those that we will need to change the way that we approach either managing them in the case of ex-offenders or supporting them in the case of those with support needs. But there will be the need to revisit those things and to rethink, what does this look like in our new context? Of course, once we've identified the people who need support, who need our care, we need to then start to think through, well, what are the responsibilities to protect them? How can we minister to them safely in this changing environment? And the first level that we need to think about is the level of governance. So this would be trustees, this would be leaders, those who are responsible for making sure that safeguarding was working effectively across the organisation. Now, for those people, what we do need to emphasise is that our responsibility to safeguard remains. In other words, safeguarding has not been suspended during this period. What is happening is that we are applying safeguarding to a different context, but the principles that we would always have worked to must continue. As trustees, all of those legal duties that we have to ensure that we have effective systems in place, that our designated safeguarding officers or safeguarding leads are supported, all of those responsibilities continue as though nothing had changed. What, of course, we need to think through is how do we apply those principles in this changed context. And so one of the key things is going to be to risk assess how we are approaching delivering our services, delivering the meetings and the various things, activities that we do. How are we delivering those using different platforms, using different technology maybe, but we need to risk assess and make sure that we have thought through carefully what the various associated risks are. And then as we move to deliver in different ways, we need to think about the question of accountability. We need to think about how do we make sure that now that we have less visibility, we're not all meeting together in the same room, we're meeting virtually. How do we make sure that we're providing proper accountability for everybody who's engaging in ministry? How do we make sure that we've got proper oversight of what is going on? Because the responsibility to do that still remains. We want to be thinking through our policies and our procedures, and one of the questions that many of us are asking is should we be changing our policy and procedure or not? This is a tricky question. It's a very, very thorny question, and I certainly don't want to pretend that there is anything straightforward here. The next area that I want us to give some consideration to is the area of governance. Of course, as church leaders, as trustees, our responsibility to safeguard the vulnerable doesn't go away just because we're in difficult times. In fact, if anything, the need to think these things through carefully increases in these times rather than being put on the back burner. As trustees, we have a responsibility to make sure that as we respond, as we change, and let's be honest, in a situation where many of us are thinking on our feet, we're almost going day to day trying to work out how to respond. And as trustees, it's really important that we keep good control of what's going on, that we're thinking carefully, that we're risk assessing effectively, and that we're planning properly to make sure that as we move forward, what we're doing is safe and what we're doing is compliant with charity regulations. And that where there are issues that we need to be addressing, we're identifying those and we're responding to those in a timely manner. Of course, it may be that some of us have been swept along and we've made various changes, we've responded in various ways, and now we're just getting to that stage of beginning to think, okay, so what do we need to do to sort of mop this up? So whether this is in a planned sense where we're doing this exercise before we make changes, or whether we're coming at this retrospectively, thinking about the governance is really, really important for us. So for trustees, it is that responsibility to ensure that as we start to minister in a different way, as we use different formats to engage with people and to communicate with people, that we're keeping in mind our responsibility to safeguard all of those who are coming into the sphere of influence of the church. It's important that we're continuing to think through how are we supporting our safeguarding leads and our volunteers and workers who may be the ones who are actually implementing some of the decisions that we've taken. How are we making sure that we're supporting them effectively, and how are we making sure that we're providing that proper accountability? really, really important that we do formal risk assessments on what we're doing and the way that we're approaching doing church in these times. Even though they're temporary situations, in actual fact, there are a whole host of new risks that we will be having to manage simply because we have stopped meeting in a physical building and we've started meeting in a virtual context. Of course, there will be other things that we used to do which we don't need to continue to do because they were very specific to the context of a physical meeting in a physical space and those kinds of things. And so it's really important that we're thinking through what is the new context, what are the risks there, how are we going to manage those risks. And also, in this new context, how are we going to provide accountability for our staff, for our volunteers, and for those who are working on behalf of the church? As trustees, that is a duty that we have. It does lead us to what is quite a thorny question, and that's the question of policies and procedures. Now, this is one of those situations where I think in one sense, whatever you do, you could be in the wrong. And so we just need to recognise that as a reality. But we are in that situation where we just need to think about how we're going to approach our policies and procedures. It may well be that there are things in your policies and procedures which are not practical to do at this point in time because of the limitations that are placed upon us. It may be that there are areas that you had to think about which are now not risk areas. And it may be that there are new risk areas that you do have to address. And we need to think about how we're going to reflect this in the documentation that we have. Do we change our policies and procedures? Do we ignore our policies and procedures and just override them because of the context? What do we need to be doing? Now, I want to be very practical here, and I want to be very realistic here. And I can't cover every eventuality. I've already indicated we can only deal with some general principles here. But nonetheless, in terms of those general principles, I think what I would be saying is understand what the change is, understand what the change in practice is, understand what the change in delivery is, understand what the risks are, and then ask yourself the question, is this a temporary change? In other words, once lockdown is released and we get back to whatever normality we get back to, and I think that's a very interesting question. I think at the end of this process, we're certainly going to have to be reviewing policies and procedures as well as reviewing the effectiveness of what we have done, the way we have responded. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. In terms of policy and procedure at this moment in time, is this a temporary change? It's just a change that we're making until we come out of this and then we will return to normal. Or actually, is this opening up an opportunity that we might want to continue to develop on an ongoing basis? Now, I think in a sense, the second of those is the easiest one to deal with. If we're dealing with a change that we're going to make and we're thinking, actually, this is a pretty good way to work and we'd like to continue this on as we move forward, there is no question. We need to make sure that we modify our policies and our procedures. The one I think that is more difficult is where we're making temporary changes that we recognise we're going to override or return to our previous practice as soon as this lockdown is over. Now, that raises a difficult question for us. Do we update the policy? Now, we can do that, but of course what that will need to do is to have the flexibility to bring in the new challenges without undermining the old systems. And so it may well be that we need to change some of the ways that we do things and the way that we word things in the policies in order to reflect the reality of what we're doing. So that's one way of doing it, is to change the policies, supplement them, add to them, and delete what's not necessary. Of course, what that means is that you might then have to go back and put the policy back as it was at the end of that process. And so that's worth thinking through. Now, this isn't ideal. and certainly under normal circumstances, this is not something that I would be recommending. But I think given that we are in extraordinary times, given that we're in unprecedented times, we need to apply some common sense here. And so I think there is another way to do this. And I think that the way is essentially to replace the policy temporarily with a risk assessment. Now, I want to be very clear and very careful in how I explain what I mean here. Firstly, all of the principles that we are working to must absolutely stay in play. What we're doing here is not lowering the standard, is not messing things up. What we're doing is thinking through how do we apply all of the safeguards that we had previously in this new context. And so it may well be that what we want to do is, rather than rewriting the policy, to actually do a risk assessment that says during the period of lockdown, when we can't be operating in this way for these reasons, this is what we're going to do. Now, it's really important, if we're not going to change the policy and procedures, that we risk assess that thoroughly, that we record thoroughly what we're overriding. It's never a good idea to simply override our policies and procedures. What that does, if we say to people, well, we can't work to them at the moment, so don't worry about it. If we take that very kind of lax approach to this, what we do is that we say to our staff, well, safeguarding isn't really that important. And actually it is. So if we're going to override the policies, what I would say is that we need to have a risk assessment. We need to literally say we are going to override point number such and such. We need to indicate the duration for which that is going to be overridden. That might be a date, but more likely it will be a condition. So, for example, it might say until we are able to start meeting again physically in the building, this is going to be the new arrangement. And so what it's doing is it's giving a very clear statement that says this is where we're varying from the policy. And if it's not specifically and explicitly stated that we vary from the policy, then the policy stands. And so it would be possible to approach it in that way. What I think we shouldn't be doing is simply overriding the policies without any kind of documentary record and without any specific instruction to people as to what we want them to do in their place. But equally, it would seem silly to be changing policies and procedures for temporary measures, which we may never, hopefully, we may never return to again. And so it may be better to think about carefully and while still maintaining the principles of your policy and procedure, to do a risk assessment and an action plan which specifically indicates what the variances are for this specific period of time and how we're going to handle those things. And of course, we need to be monitoring that for effectiveness throughout this period. And I would also suggest that at the end of this crisis, that we also do a formal review as trustees as to how did we respond, what lessons have we learned, what could we have done better, so that we can at least learn those lessons. Whatever approach we choose to use, I think it's vital that we document carefully what it is that we're doing. What are the decisions we've taken? Why have we taken those decisions? What is it that we're going to be doing? And keeping that documentation. And so as the situation evolves, maintain a formal record of decisions that you've taken, particularly decisions that have either introduced a new approach or that have meant that the way that we did something previously can't continue, or that we're going to explicitly do something different. So really just kind of thinking through very carefully, what are we changing? How are we giving clarity to our staff, to our volunteers? How are we making sure everybody understands the basis on which we're operating? How are we understanding where we're having to approach things in a different way? And what does that look like from a safeguarding perspective? Making sure that we've got absolute clarity, and then that as trustees, we're providing the necessary accountability and ongoing monitoring of that situation to make sure that we are still fulfilling our legal duties as trustees. Now, once we've sorted out the governance side of things, the next thing to think about is the operational level, the actual practice of safeguarding. And so we need to give some serious consideration to policy and procedure. Now, just to be clear about what I mean here, I'm not talking about rewriting or developing the policies or the procedures. I've discussed that already in the governance section. But what I mean is, once we give a set of instructions to our staff, this is how we're going to operate during this time, whether that be through a revised policy or whether that be through a separate instruction. We need to just be thinking about how do we deal with that instruction. I think the first thing to say is it's really important that with any ministry that we continue during this time in any format, we need to give a very, very clear message that safeguarding is not on hold. Indeed, there are greater safeguarding risks, and so we need to be even more vigilant and even more robust in our approach to safeguarding. And so while we may be having to vary things, we may be having to work in different ways, we may be saying, look, this is what the policy says, that's what we do normally, but this is what we're going to do during this period of time. While we may be doing that, it's really important that people understand the reason we're doing that is to make sure that in this changed context, we are still safeguarding people effectively. It's not that safeguarding has gone on hold, it's that safeguarding needs to be approached differently because there are now new and different risks that we weren't facing previously. All of the principles that we've applied in our safeguarding policies need to come across into this new approach. This really is not a case of overriding safeguarding. It's a case of reapplying those principles into a different context. And so it's about upholding the basic principles, but applying them into that new context. Of course, as always, we need to make sure that what we're asking people to do is effective. It needs to work. It needs to work to keep people safe. We need to make sure that, for example, if we're going to move a youth group online and we're going to use one of the platforms that allows us to do a sort of video conferencing type approach, and we're going to do some games with young people, or we're going to do some Bible study with young people, whatever it may be, that what we say works in that context. It's got to be effective. That's part of the responsibility of the trustees, isn't it? Is to make sure that safeguarding is effective across the organisation. So we need to make sure that what we're doing is effective in this new, in this changing, in this challenging context. Does it work? Does it keep people safe? And of course, as always, accuracy. Does it accurately reflect what we want people to do? Does the policy, does the instruction, does the risk assessment, whatever it may be, however you've gone about it, does it actually reflect what we want people to do? I think another thing to be really clear about is that where we're making temporary changes, and we will be making some temporary changes, really being clear with people that these are temporary, that they are only in place until whatever the condition is. For example, until we come out of this period of lockdown, and therefore we're going to stop meeting in that virtual sense, and we're going to return to doing things the way that we used to, that kind of thing. So where we're making a temporary change, being really clear with people that this is not permission for them to continue to operate in this new way indefinitely into the future, but this is the end point. This is the purpose. This is the end point. It's a temporary change. What kinds of things might be changing? Well, for example, one of the things that you will have in your policy will be the question of ratios. How many adults do we have to have for each child that we have present? Now, of course, in the context of young people accessing a group online, those ratios take on a different significance, because we're not actually providing care for the child. What we're providing is adults to organise and to lead an activity, but we're not taking responsibility for them. They remain the responsibility of the parents while they're in the home. And so those ratios are something that we can probably relax somewhat. That said, we may have certain principles over and above the ratios which say, well, in this group we want to make sure that we have at least one male, one female, for example. That would be a fairly common one that we would see. And so even though the ratios disappear, it may well be that there are some aspects of that. For example, we want to make sure that we have at least one male, at least one female in that virtual meeting. We want to be really clear that that principle has got to carry over. And so that would be an area that we would need to give some serious thought to. What about the designated safeguarding lead or the safeguarding officer? What do your procedures say about how you handle a concern that you have? Do you fill out a form? Have you got a physical piece of paper that's stored in a folder that you always have at the group? And what does it look like now to operate and to raise a concern with your safeguarding lead? Can you actually operate the way that your safeguarding procedures say? Or is it now essentially physically impossible to achieve what you've got written down because of that changed context? And so we need to be thinking about the effectiveness, the accuracy of our policies and procedures, that the principles are not on hold, but that the context has changed. And therefore we need to modify what we're doing in line with the new reality that we are experiencing. So really important that we give some serious thought to all of those policies and procedures, our codes of conduct, all that kind of stuff, to make sure that we're covering what we need to cover, that those procedures are effective in keeping people safe and raising concerns where we need to, that they're accurate, that they truly reflect what we want people to do, that everybody understands what the arrangements are in these difficult times, and everybody understands, is this a continuation of what we did? Is this a modification of what we previously did? At what point is it going to return back? And those kinds of things need that absolute clarity so that everybody knows why they're working. So once we're clear about how we want people to work, it's really important that our workers are being vigilant. Now, this is not an unusual theme. You'll know from training, it's one of the key themes that we have when we consider training. The theme of vigilance is really important. We all need to be on the lookout. We need to be aware that safeguarding concerns, safeguarding issues, children could be at risk, adults could be at risk. That's just an ongoing a part of what we do. But of course, the challenge for us in these times is that vigilance looks somewhat different now, based on the changing context and the changing circumstances. And so we just need to think that through, and we need to make sure that our staff understand that just because these are different times, just because they're difficult times, just because they're challenging times, doesn't mean that we need to be, or we can be, any less vigilant. Obviously, I think I've already indicated this in what we've said on previous slides, but in actual fact what we need is far greater awareness of safeguarding because the times are different and because we're not as comfortable and as familiar. One of the key areas I think that's really important here is how do we support our workers? One of the things that we will always be saying to our workers is, look, if you've got concerns, this is what you do. This is who you go to, the support there for you. How does that look now? Does that look different now? Do they need to access that support in different ways? Do they need to communicate in different ways? These kinds of issues are really, really important. How accessible is your safeguarding lead now? How accessible is their team leader now in this new strange world that we are in? So we need to really make sure that our workers understand how they're going to be supported, what we're expecting of them, and we need to be really clear that we are supporting them to effectively minister and safely minister in this changed context. We are working differently, and whenever we start to work differently, it's difficult, it's challenging. There are new things that we have to consider, things that were really high priority previously, maybe and not quite so high priority now. But things that maybe weren't even on our radar previously, we now need to be taking into account. So really just thinking through very carefully, what are the implications of working differently, and what does vigilance look like in this new context? And of course that needs to take account of the format of the delivery of what we're doing, the platforms that we're using. Are we, for example, dealing with a one-way communication system like we've got here, where I'm talking to you but you can't talk back? Or are we looking at a more interactive process? Are we encouraging people to go online who maybe wouldn't have accessed our services online before? And does that introduce any risks? And all of these kinds of questions start to come into play. And what does vigilance look like for our staff, for our volunteers? What does vigilance look like in this brave new world? How do we deal with that? What are the challenges for us? What are the things we need to think through? What are the things we need to change? How are we going to support staff to make sure that if there are concerns that are manifesting themselves, that we know what we're doing and we know how we're going to respond to them? So vigilance, while in one sense it doesn't change, it continues to be absolutely critical. What that looks like will be somewhat different in this new context. Now, this brings us on to the final theme that I want to touch on in this webinar, which is the theme of technology. And this is obviously a huge challenge for us. It is the obvious solution for most of us in terms of keeping in contact with people, in terms of delivery of our services. It's the way that we're going to be going, and we're grateful that we're living in times where we have so much technology that we can make use of, so that in this time of lockdown we're not completely separated from each other. But technology is probably the single biggest risk factor for children and young people in society today. The risks around technology are just enormous, and so we need to be really careful as we surge to take things online, as we push to use technology and to introduce new technologies in the way that we're working. Really, really important that we're thinking carefully about what that means and what that looks like, particularly where we're dealing with vulnerable people, children, young people, vulnerable adults at risk of abuse. Very, very important that we're thinking this through. Now, I do want to be really clear here what I mean. I think it's really important that we continue to minister to these groups. So what I'm saying in this section is not in any way intended to warn anybody off using technology. I think that's the obvious way for us to go. And our children, our young people, our adults at risk of abuse, these people above any need that ongoing interaction. There's been talk, hasn't there, over recent weeks about the impact of lockdown on people's mental health. And we know that children and young people are significantly affected by this, probably disproportionately, if we're honest, affected by this. And so it's really important that we're supporting these people, but we need to think it through. We need to think through the tools that we're using. We need to think through what the risks are of those tools, and we need to think through how we're going to manage those risks. So the first thing I think is to understand the tool that we're using, the platform that we're using, the technology that we're using. And what I would say is I think that there is an incrementally increasing risk. And so I would always be aiming to go for the lowest level of risk that will achieve the aim that we need to achieve. In other words, if it's possible to do it in one of the safer modes, I would do that, but that doesn't mean that I would prevent us using some of the more risky methods. It's just that we need to be aware that they're more risky, and therefore we need to manage that risk effectively. Now, I guess the least risky method that we can use is one-way communication. Very similar to what we're doing here. We're loading a video, we're creating a video and putting it on YouTube or on our website. Um, we're creating worksheets that people can download, or whatever it may be. So the idea here is that we create something, we put it on the internet, and people can access that and can download it. Now that obviously is the least risky method that we have. The children obviously remain the responsibility of their parents throughout that time, and it would be very visible, it would be very obvious if anyone was trying to do something that they shouldn't using that format. That said, it doesn't mean that there are no risks. Even this safest of the approaches carries risk. And so, for example, let's say we're providing content for children, for young people, that they can access, they can download, they can use. It's really important that wherever we put that we make sure that we're monitoring the content. Unfortunately, we are in challenging times, and challenging times such as these tend to do one of two things. They tend to either bring out the best in people, or they bring out the worst in people. And of course, in terms of the media and what have you, we've seen both of those, haven't we? We've seen some people really going above and beyond to serve their communities, to bless their communities. But we've also seen a rise in scams, in various technological threats, where people are seeking to take advantage of the opportunities presented by the current challenges, and they're using those. We've seen situations, for example, where church meetings have been hacked, and there has been something uploaded onto the content page that may be, for example, of a pornographic nature or otherwise offensive, or dangerous to some of our vulnerable people. This is just the reality of the world that we live in. So even if we're using those one-way communication methods, we still need to be looking at that content and making sure that only the content that we want to be available is available. So that's the preferable step, if it's possible, if that will meet the need. And we would suggest that we use those kinds of methods. But again, not seeing it as risk-free, just seeing it as lower risk. I guess the next step up would be two-way communication, but that is always done in groups. Now, what I'm thinking of here is, for example, a message board type of an approach where someone posts a public comment and other people can comment on that. So, for example, you might post a discussion point, or you might post a document for people to discuss or to think about, or whatever it may be. So you post it up there. Everybody in the group can see that. Everybody in the group can comment, but there's no real-time communication. It's all done by comment, and it's not done by private message where one person can talk to another without the rest of the group seeing. It's very public. It's a message board type of an approach. Now, obviously, that again is less risky than some of the other approaches. Again, we have those high levels of visibility. It's much easier to police what's going on. It's much easier to manage what's going on than with some of the other approaches. But it does give that opportunity for interaction. And so if the one-way communication doesn't work, I then ask myself, well, does that kind of two-way communication work? So that it prevents people having to communicate directly one-to-one with others. So that would be our second tier. The third tier would be the kind of fully interactive approach. Now here I'm thinking of something like a video conferencing platform where we go into a virtual room, we're able to have conversations. We might be looking at doing breakout rooms where we get small groups together and they're doing a discussion in a small group and then coming back to the bigger group, those kinds of things. But with these platforms, not only can we talk to each other and everybody can participate, but also people can often private message each other as well, using chat functions that exist within those platforms. Now, these platforms are great and they're really, really helpful, really, really useful. Perhaps for our main service, we might be using the one-way communication method, the video type of approach. But certainly if we're looking at things like small groups and perhaps discussion groups with young people, these kinds of things, these two-way interactive platforms are very, very useful to us. But of course they come with an increased risk, and so we need to manage that. So we need to think about which level of risk do we need to go to, and don't go to an unnecessarily high level of risk. If you can use one of the less risky platforms, that's going to be a lot easier to manage than one of the more risky platforms. So go for the minimum level of risk that you can, but that doesn't mean you can't go for those conference call type setups. But we do need to be thinking about visibility. One of the great things about Teams is that we get used to the way each other work, don't we? And when you're in a physical space, it's very easy to spot things that are changing. So say, for example, you've got a leader who disappears off and goes to the toilet. You just automatically know these kinds of things. You pick up on each other's body language. You can pick up on communication, non-verbal stuff that's going on. And you get very used to working together and to making sure that things are working well, that the dynamic amongst the leaders is supportive and is helpful. And of course, as soon as we go onto an online platform, we lose that. So for example, if I just stick with that very obvious example, if you're in a group and one of the leaders needs to go and visit the bathroom and they disappear out the room, everybody's going to notice that. You start to think about a conference call, that may not be so obvious that that person isn't there, particularly if there have been problems with bandwidth and people have sort of taken off their video cameras, so you've just got their name on the screen. You wouldn't actually know if that person had worked away from their computer. So are we actually maintaining the right numbers of leaders in that group? These kinds of questions become important. And then how do we provide effective accountability? How do we make sure that everybody is working as they should be? How do we make sure that young people are behaving as they should be towards each other? How are we making sure that leaders are behaving towards young people and young people are behaving towards leaders in the way that they should? One of the great strengths of these kind of platforms is that ability to message either the whole group or specific people. But how are we making sure that we're not bringing together groups of young people and that there's some bullying going on with the group chat? How are we making sure there's not inappropriate conversations going on between leaders and young people and those kinds of things? So what we're looking to do here is to minimize the risk, to manage that risk effectively, to give ourselves the best visibility that we can, and not to take more risk than we need to. Now, obviously, we need to think about the risks around technology in all of the contexts that we're using. I said when we looked at the previous slide that it's really important, for example, even where we're using those one-way communication channels. So say, for example, you're using a YouTube channel and you're making content available there. Just making sure that nobody has posted anything inappropriate, either in terms of comments or in terms of content on there without our knowing. Those kinds of things. So even with those low risk approaches, it's really important that we're thinking carefully about the risks. But what I want to do now is think a little bit more specifically about where we are using technology to minister to those vulnerable groups, to children, to young people, to adults who are very vulnerable. And so when we start to think about the use of technology with these groups, there are some important principles that we need to work to. We definitely need to be thinking about consent, and we are looking for explicit informed consent. In other words, I wouldn't simply take consent from the fact that you've got a consent form for the group and therefore that you would apply across. No, I would get explicit consent from parents to say that they are happy for their children to join in with the activities that have gone online using and I would detail the specifics of the platform that we're using and how communication will take place and those kinds of things. That would also include, of course, clear information about if there were any concerns, who to report those to, and those kinds of issues. So real clarity, gaining consent, informed consent, so the parents understand exactly what's being done, and how they can monitor that. What are the communication routes? What are the platforms? So for example, if we're talking about younger children, it may well be appropriate to communicate via the parents rather than communicating with the children themselves, that kind of thing. So what's the communication route? Do we go directly to the children, in which case we need very clear consent that that's okay, and ideally we want safeguards built into that. Or are we going to communicate with the parents so that the parents can pass the information on to the children? I hope it would go without saying, but certainly if we're going to run any kind of a group activity online, then any staff or volunteers who are involved in that group must be DBS checked, and they must have gone through the safe recruitment processes exactly the same as if you were working in a physical space in a building. Need to think about the format that we're using. As I said earlier, can we use that one-way format, or can we use one of those less risky two-way communication but more message boardy type approach, or do we need to have that video chat available? Really thinking through what is it we're trying to achieve, what's the best platform to use, how can we minimize the risk, and what risk there is, how can we manage that effectively? Ratios are one of the few areas where, of course, we can relax things a little bit, because you're not physically taking responsibility for that group of children and young people. Now, whether you want to reduce ratios is another question altogether. But because obviously you're not, technically speaking, taking control, or you're not taking responsibility for those children, then we wouldn't need to maintain ratios in the same way that we would if we were in a physical space. That said, we do need to have very clear principles about who can and can't, and how many people we should have in the room, and those kinds of things. That all needs to be considered. So although our ratios as such, in terms of sort of childcare ratios, if you like, may not be relevant because we're not taking responsibility for the children, we do still need to think about how many leaders there are and what's the mix of those, and those kinds of questions. Where we're using those formats, particularly those interactive formats, thinking about password protection. So, for example, if we are using a call setup, we're using one of the conference call type platforms that are out there, that the meeting itself is password protected, that any meeting which isn't a public meeting, in other words, where you would want to know exactly who was there, is password protected. Those kinds of things would come in. Monitoring the content that's on whatever platform you're using, really important. Where we're using those sort of video conferencing type facilities, really thinking carefully about room access. So for example, making sure that if your rule, for example, is that there must be at least 3 leaders and there must be at least 1 male and 1 female, how do we make sure that we've got those people in the room before we allow young people to come in? And so some of these platforms, for example, would have a waiting room area where the children, the young people, can be that they can log on. They know that the meeting is about to start, but we don't actually allow them to come into the room until such time as all of the leaders are there. How do we make sure that the meeting is ended when all of the leaders are still there? In other words, we haven't got leaders logging out and leaving a leader on their own with a child in that virtual room. These kinds of things, just that coordination of things that would still need to be kept in place. And many of these programs will have a variety of functionalities for monitoring, for creating logs of what's going on, and those kinds of things. One thing, for example, that we would certainly be looking to use would be to download any chat logs, so that we could make sure that there was nothing going on either between young people or between young people and leaders that would give us cause for concern. These things can be very easy to hide on this kind of platform, but most of the platforms will allow you to download the chat logs for what has gone on during the course of that meeting. So those kinds of approaches will be really important. There's a very tricky and a sensitive area, which would be the recording of those meetings. Now, obviously, if you have multiple leaders in there, and we would suggest to you that you ought to have multiple leaders in there, you wouldn't want just one leader in that room on their own with the young people, under normal circumstances at least. Um, but you know, if you've got multiple leaders in that meeting, it perhaps becomes less significant. But even so, you might want to consider, for example, making an audio recording of that meeting. We try to avoid video wherever possible, but even that, under these circumstances, may be a wise move. Now, it does raise a significant question for us, which is the question of data retention. Obviously, on the one hand, we have the responsibility to safeguard the children, the young people, but we also have to comply with GDPR legislation as well. Now, under normal circumstances, we would be saying, look, don't do video, don't be recording those kinds of things. But there may be a case here, in certain circumstances at least, whereby to, so for example, make an audio recording of that meeting. After the meeting, someone independent, someone in leadership maybe, or someone who isn't a part of that group of leaders, listens through the audio logs. Once they've listened through the logs, the log is deleted, but a record is maintained that the audio log and the chat logs for that particular meeting were examined by this person on this date, and there was nothing of concern in them. That kind of thing might be a way forward. Now, that's a complex area, and we would certainly recommend that you give us a call on the advice line and just chat through with us if you're thinking about using those kinds of recording systems. But they are built into some of these platforms, and there may be a possibility for you to use. The other thing that we would say is that whatever activity you're doing online, you still need to maintain registers. Those registers, of course, must include the names of the leaders as well as the young people who attend. They would be retained in the normal way that you would any register for any group that you ran, and formal risk assessments for those meetings should also be in place, exactly as you would if you were meeting in a physical space. Obviously, the risks will be different if you're using a technology-based space, but nonetheless, really important that those basic good practice principles, our codes of conduct, all those kinds of things are still in place, even though we're using a different format. The format can bring new challenges for us, and we need to rise to those. It certainly doesn't give us an excuse to drop our guard, to lower our standards, and to get away with sloppy practice. So really important that we're robust in the way that we approach the use of technology in these times. So let's just try and summarise the various things that we have been talking about here. One of the first thing I want to say, key principle, safeguarding is not on hold while we're in these challenging, these difficult times. We need to recognise that the increased risk and the different risks, new risks, and we need to manage those risks effectively. So safeguarding not on hold. We still need to be vigilant. We still need to be reporting any concerns and recording those concerns. We still need to be passing those on externally to children's social care or the police or what have you, just exactly as we would at any other time. And of course, we need careful risk assessment. We need to be leading that from the front. Those of us who are church leaders, those of us who are trustees, those of us who have the responsibilities for safeguarding need to be leading from the front. Careful risk assessment, both of the overall strategic approach and also of any activities that we're running, for example, online during this time. The basic principles of safeguarding must be maintained. Now, of course, we're in a different context and therefore we apply those principles in a different way. But we're not here talking about lowering the standards of safeguarding. We're maintaining those standards. What we're talking about here is how do we maintain those high standards while at the same time moving the format of delivery, moving the mode of delivery, moving the platforms that we're using, etc. We're in a different context, so we need to reapply the principles to that new context. So in order to do that, we need to understand the context, we need to understand what we're doing, why we're doing it, we need to understand what the risks are of those various decisions that we've taken, and we need to manage those effectively. What I do want to say, though, we've done a lot of cautionary stuff here, and I do want to reiterate. We say this again and again in training, and I think I've already said it earlier on in this presentation. Safeguarding is not about preventing legitimate activity. If we have something that as a church we want to do to bless the community that's legitimate, that's safe, etc., safeguarding practices should not prevent us from doing it. Safeguarding is about keeping people safe while we do the activities that we do. It's not about stopping us from doing things that are legitimate and that are right for us to do. And so if you're struggling with that, if you're struggling with how do we work that through, for example, we've got a real heart for these young people. They're not in school, they're isolated, they're struggling. We want to be able to minister to them. Absolutely right that we do that. But we just need to think through carefully how we do that. So safeguarding is not a barrier to us doing these things. We just need to make sure that we're keeping people safe and that we're prioritising that and we're thinking it through carefully. And as I have already said, we are here. We have the advice line. The advice line is available from 8 in the morning through till 10 o'clock at night, 7 days a week. If we're on a call or if we can't get to the call at the time, just leave a message and we will call you back as soon as we can. So please don't hesitate to get in touch if there is anything further that we can do. I hope this session has been useful, but as I say, it's not possible to cover all of the questions, and so please do contact us. You can contact us by email, you can contact us by phone. If it's specific stuff that's specific to your context, we're more than happy to answer those. It may be that there's something that we've missed that we should have talked through, or that something isn't as clear as it appears to be to me, and so it may be that we want to add some additional resources on the website. But please do let us know if there are any queries, any questions at all that you have, and we hope this session has been useful to you. Well, here are the contact details. Please do feel free to contact us at any point. That's not a problem at all. We're more than happy to help in any way that we can. I hope that you have found this information useful. There is more information available, and we will be continuing to provide more and more information. If you're not signed up for our newsletter, please do consider doing that. We'll be keeping you in touch with things as they change, as they develop. We'll be making sure that we're posting that out. And we do offer a whole range of services, so if any of those other services are helpful to you, please do take them up. In particular, we'd be very grateful if you would sign up for one of the free memberships of CSS. That way we can keep in touch with you, we can make sure that we're passing across useful information and those kinds of things. We do provide a whole range of training, and in fact we've been moving training online over recent times. We have a blended approach where there is an online element where you sign on to an account and you do some learning, and then we do a Zoom meeting face to face where we have some discussion and we apply the information that you've learned. That may be useful to you, particularly if you've got lots of people in lockdown, if lots of your youth workers, kids workers are in lockdown. This might be a good opportunity to get your safeguarding training up to date, and it would certainly be helpful to us because as I'm sure you will appreciate, all of our training has stopped, and so that has had a significant impact. But we're here to serve. We're here to be a blessing to the church, to the Lord's kingdom, and if there's anything that we can do at all to help you in your ministry, to help you to think through the things you need to think through, to help you to do safeguarding well and to do safeguarding to the glory of God, then please don't hesitate to contact us. I'll be delighted to help you. So thank you very much for your time, and I hope it's been useful. Goodbye.